So I think that Hegelian and Marxist dimension, for some reason, has gone missing in Slavoj, in relation to particularly starting with the pandemic. Although I have to say that he kind of acknowledged my my perspective also, and he gave me some credit in connection with my analysis of my economic analysis of the pandemic as a kind of monetary event rather than an epidemiological crisis. So he did recognize it, but at the same time he kind of said that I was very close to being a conspiracy theorist. and that's where I don't know what to say there at that level, because conspiracy theorist, my God, I'm definitely not one. I'm talking about capital as an impersonal machine, as a impersonal drive. That is, yes. At the same time, you can't deny that there are people driving this impersonal machine, right? But that doesn't make me a conspiracy theorist.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
My name is Fabio Vighi. I'm a lecturer at Cardiff University. I teach mostly film studies, but also critical theory, psychoanalytic theory, and I'm particularly interested in critical theory and political economy. And I try to apply my understanding of political economy and to today's situation. So I've been looking at what the economy means today as a discourse, particularly the fact that it's finance-driven, driven by the finance industry more and more, and what that means really for the mode of production and for the societies that rely on such economy. What are the symptoms of the crisis that we're going through at the moment? So that's briefly what I've been researching in recent years.
Reading through your articles at the Philosopher's Salon, I believe is where I saw that you put the COVID lockdowns and the COVID pandemic into the context of crisis, economic crisis and financial crisis. How would you explain the underlying causes of the economic crisis that we've been coming in and out of, I guess, since the 70s, but certainly since 2008? What would you point to explain those crises?
Yeah, I would point to the fact that our economy is getting more and more, is relying more and more on credit, fundamentally. And this credit is not the credit that Marx was necessarily talking about in the 19th century. This is credit that doesn't come from the real economy. It doesn't come from the work society. It doesn't come from taxation. It's mouse clicked, to put it simply. Most of the credit that we're dealing with today, and that is causing the current inflationary crisis, which is a money crisis, obviously, that's how it manifests itself, is caused by the avalanche of credit that has been created over the past decades. And this mountain of credit is what supports the real economy too. I mean, this is the passage that I think is crucial to understand. Mm-hmm. That the idea that what we call the real economy, the retail economy, Main Street economy, the labor economy, where surplus value is created, is increasingly colonized by insubstantial credit. So by credit that is simply created out of nothing, literally with a click of a mouse, of a computer, by central banks mostly, but by banks in general. And this mountain of credit, this mass of money supply inevitably ends up devaluing our currencies. And even if, of course, it's invested in the real economy, the disproportion between the mass of credit itself, which needs to grow exponentially, and the value that is created in the real economy grows. So the gap between the real value or surplus value extracted from labor in the real economy and the mountain of credit that is added to the system increases. And that, the increasing of that gap is what fundamentally creates a condition of what I call secular or structural inflation, or devaluation. Now it's manifesting itself as inflation, but it could soon manifest itself as deflation. If there's a market crash, a lot of capital will be destroyed directly on the ground, with jobs going in closures of businesses, etc. That would probably bring the prices down, but that would be a loss of value regardless. It would materialize as the debasement of our currencies. And I think crisis for me today manifests itself fundamentally as a money crisis, right? I mean, we know that capital is in constant state of metamorphosis. There are, it's a processual entity. We can think of capital in many ways, but certainly one of the ways in which capital today is in crisis is, we can find out by looking at the fact that our currencies are being debased, and this is a historical trend. That they are being debased, through history in recent decades, and I think there's a correlation between the mass of money that has been injected into the system, and the fact that our currencies are losing their value. I mean, this is not just monetary theory, right? Because a lot of people I speak to, they think, oh, this is monetary theory, well, it isn't. I mean, the problem is that really we've passed a point where, we passed the point of no return. So much money has been created, and yes, of course, some of it goes into investment in real labor and real growth, as it were, on the ground. But the disproportion now is such that inevitably we get the devaluation of currency. Do you know what I mean? There's the exponential growth of credit, and we live in a debt-based system, and the only solution we have now to deal with this massive debt is by creating more debt. Or by creating more credit, depends on which way you look at it. But basically, to increase the monetary mass, the mass of money that is being created, and that way, capital can only the trajectory of capitalism can only be implosive.
Okay.
So
there's another Marxist who I've spoken to in the past, named Michael Roberts, who describes the period that we've been in since the 70s up until today as either the long recession or the long depression. And in the 70s, the economic crisis that arose then kind of set up the conditions of neoliberalism, which I think are defined partly by the financialization that you've been talking about, as well as, certain kinds of trade agreements and deregulation, and a variety of other things, but kind of a rolling back of the Fordist or welfare state approach to managing capital and creating a highly financialized and state-dependent form of capitalist management. Last night I was talking to my girlfriend, and she was telling me that women hadn't had equal rights with men for all that long in some ways, because, for instance, they didn't have the right to get their own credit card until 1974 in the United States. And I thought about that, and I kind of looked into it, and I realized that the credit card itself hadn't been around for that long, and it really had only been available widely since 1966. So it put the whole question of like whether or not you should measure liberty and freedom in terms of getting a credit card, into question. Yeah. But my point here is that is there something underlying the economic crisis? I mean, in the real economy that creates these conditions for financialization.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I think that from my point of view, the real watershed moment is the third industrial revolution. That's exactly in the 1970s, even if it then materializes in the 80s, we can argue. But it begins in the 1970s, and that's microelectronics, that's digitization, right? And the effect of that on the valorization of capital is immense, because all of a sudden, less and less value is created out of the exploitation of labor, human labor, precisely because machines become productive, more and more productive. So technology becomes more and more productive. Less and less labor is employed is valorized in economic terms. So what we have is more and more production, growing productivity with less labor productive input, right? So in Marxian terms, you would say that you have a massive growth of constant capital, and variable capital diminishes, which changes the organic composition of capital as a whole. And I think that is the crucial moment which determines the crisis of valorization that we're experiencing now. And neoliberalism was partly an answer to that crisis, insofar as it implied precisely that financialization that you mentioned. All of a sudden, the center of value production was no longer the factory, but it was the financial sector. And credit cards became the fundamental thing. Debt became central, right? Debt or credit, once again, compensates for the lack of valorization in the real economy. So, we can moralize and about the neoliberalism, and we should, but at the same time, I see it as a kind of immanent process within the mode of production. The moment capitalism cannot count on enough value created in the real economy through its original formula, which is the formula that puts people to work essentially in order to extract surplus value from labor. That moment determines the leap, as it were, into neoliberalism, where the financial sector becomes more and more dominant. And in the financial sector, of course, money creates money, without labor, without the labor mediation. So you don't.
My understanding of the financial sector is that at base, what it is constant bets on the future of the future ability of capital to expand how many people or how much exploitation can be gotten out of the people who are working. So you're making a bet, or you're loaning money to, you could directly invest in real production, and then you're making a bet that way, or you could speculate or around
assets.
Right. And
so
they're constantly saying, oh, well, down the road, the real economy is going to come back up into.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. I think that's a very good analogy there. You can think of it in terms of temporality. So the old economy based on labor, maybe, we can think of value as being produced and being available from the past. It's already been realized. It's there. You can use it. You can invest it in, to create more capital, essentially, or more value. Whereas in a finance-driven economy, all of a sudden value is in the future. It's an escape into the future, situation, because, as you say, we're always running after value that has not yet been created. You know, we're always relying on the illusion that at some point this value that we're betting on will be created in the future, right? That's how the financial sector reproduces itself. So, you know, but that way you also increase the potential for crisis, because the imbalance then increases, the contradictions increase. And as we've seen in recent decades, there's one financial crisis after the other. We know that there's plenty of financial crises that effectively threaten the system with a market crash that would be lethal for most of us, as a matter of fact, because our dependency on the speculative financial system has increased so massively in recent years. So we're definitely in a post-Keynesian economic system that is no longer driven by the real economy, as we can call it, and is increasingly driven by credit and credit that goes directly into the financial sector. The point, however, is that it doesn't stay there. You know, because a lot of people made the argument, yes, but you know, all this credit doesn't create inflation because it stays trapped within the financial speculations. The point, however, is that, you know, for a while now, it's started to colonize the real economy. In other words, you get real growth, but this real growth is already some kind of hybrid or hybrid growth, because it's already colonized by insubstantial credit that comes down from the financial sector. So then we get a kind of imbalance, which today manifests itself precisely as the devaluation of money. And again, this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that is here to stay. They sold it to us as a temporary phenomenon initially, if you remember, after COVID, and they blamed it precisely. They need an enemy, and here we go back to emergencies. Why we need emergencies all the time? They need an enemy to blame all these imbalances and contradictions on. So Putin, COVID, and so on. There will be more. So we can externalize, you know, the problem and say, oh, it's their fault. And inflation is a perfect case in point, because we're saying, oh, it's Putin's fault. You know, it's the energy situation that Putin caused that is now driving prices up and, you know, causing this erosion of purchasing power. Just like we say, oh, it's because of COVID lockdowns. And yes, partly it's because of that too. But the fundamental issue here is that we've created a mechanism that inevitably leads to inflation. You know, after decades of injections, monetary injections, inevitably at some point, after an incubation period, it will materialize as inflation. And exactly that's exactly what's going on at the moment. And you know, there's no real solution to this. That's what I'm trying to say. And people are not, this is you know, this is not just something that will go away very easily. It will only go away through another kind of money debasement, which could be deflation. But you know, deflation would be very painful. If there's a market crash and a deflationary cycle, then it would be even more painful than what we have now. So, you know, that's the other argument that we could discuss. Those who are controlling the system have now cordoned themselves. You know, they've painted themselves into a corner and they don't really know how to get out of it. They don't have many solutions. They don't have many ways of getting out of this mess that they've created. And they're trying to control money, the cost of money, of course, with interest rates, etc. But as we've seen in recent months, even with the banking crisis, just, a couple of months ago, you know, raising interest rates in a debt bubble, in a debt crisis, will only create more pain. So they have to stop at some point. They have to stop with hiking rates. However, if they go back to cheap money and quantitative easing, which we know that they started in 2008, after the great financial crisis, if we go back to that, inflation will go even higher. So in that sense, we are in a lose-lose situation in terms of economic policy, monetary policy. There's not much we can do. At the same time, thinking of reigniting a growth cycle in the real economy is also a delusion, in my opinion, simply because with the technology we have today and the competition for that technology, less and less value productive labor will be mobilized.
I think that when we think about inflation, we tend to think in a kind of narrow way, just on the value of our currencies, maybe in relationship to other currencies first, and then in relationship to commodities. But I think the key is to think about labor, like wages, because if it were the case that wages and also the way that the money relates to other commodities, because if it were the case, okay, well, we need more money to buy the same commodities, but everyone's getting more money, right? Then it would equal out to the same thing. It wouldn't really matter. But
it would be a healthy type of inflation in that case, right? Something that we could deal with because wages are going up and they're matching the rate of inflation.
Right.
But we're not seeing that at all at the moment. We know that wages are going down even, or at least they're stagnant.
Yeah,
they're not moving, and that's again for an imminent kind of reason. Capital,
or even when they grow, they're not growing fast enough to keep up with inflation. So it is a labor issue. It's labor's interests are what are not being met, and that also means that part of the problem is that the capitalist class who are productive can't necessarily afford to hire as many people, and they also in the really, and then you go in the United States to the fact that you're talking about unproductive labor to a large extent anyway. You're talking about service industry, and other kinds of workers who may or may not be producing value depending on how you look at it or where they are in the economy. I could get nerdy and, try to dig in to see just exactly to what degree you and I have the same vision of the economy. But let's just agree that one of the things that's going on that's defining our politics is the fact that on a fundamental level, on the level of production and the economy and the social relationships that set up that aspect of our everyday life, the part of our life where things are made that we need, that where food is grown and commodities are produced and things go into the market and exchange between nations. All of that is in a crisis. Maybe it's fundamentally a crisis of profitability as well as a inflationary crisis. But the way in which that gets managed is a political question. It's not just a question about, because it's intractable, most of all, it's a political question. Like, how do we maintain the failure is sort of the question.
I think that's what it is. Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of kicking the can down the road. That's what we're seeing. Politicians, all they do, and that's what they hire to do that, is to kick the can down, to prolong the agony, to make sure that the system, which is already a dead system in many respects, right? It's definitely on a downward trajectory and has been for a few years now, that continues despite the fact that it's already a kind of zombie system for the majority of us anyway, right? There's a few 0.01 whatever super rich who will continue to benefit from it, and those are those who are pulling the strings really, although there's also this immanent law that I'm talking about, right? It is the law of profit. And the law of profit it goes together with the law of competition. If you want to compete, you need to get today, and as always, you need to increase your investment in technology mostly, and you need to drive down the cost of labor. Otherwise, you're out. Otherwise, you won't be able, to compete and therefore to make any profits. The problem, I think, is also a kind of optical problem here, because if we're thinking about individual capitals, you can think, okay, if I've invested properly in technology, if I've done all I had to do, I can win here in a specific aspect of the market. I can be a winner. I can make profits, and my rate of profit might increase. The problem is that overall the total mass decreases, because less and less value is being created by labor, and more value is being created through by machines fundamentally. And this is something that Marx saw early on. Of course, the 19th century, the theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, fundamentally it's about this. Of course, it couldn't foresee the degree of automation that would kick in in the 20th century, but he had a sense that all of a sudden we could become dependent more and more on credit, or interest-bearing capital, as he calls it, because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Of course, he couldn't foresee, as I said, the kind of dimension of this that we're seeing now. But I think now we are fully within that distorted economic situation. We're more and more dependent on mouse-clicked credit, and the mountain of debt or credit is increasing all the time. Like the world, I think, has a 300 trillion and counting debt to repay. We're talking about, I think, 640 billion in interest only for the United States, right? Only in interest to repay. I mean, it's unsustainable. It's a crazy system.
How much? How many billions?
I think it's 640.
Oh my
in
God.
interest only. In interest only, right? I mean, that's right. The figure I got in mind. I might be wrong, but it's around that. 640 billion in interest only to repay, right? Is this a healthy economy? Is this a healthy society? No. We're living on a kind of illusion, right? That things are working. They're not working, and it's not temporary. I mean, this is really a kind of a gradual descent into some kind of barbaric condition that we haven't seen anything yet. I don't think we've seen anything. COVID was maybe the starter of the decade. The decade started with COVID, and then it continued with COVID. I think of it as the war on the war on virus, as they called it at the beginning. And I think they were right in calling it a war, because ultimately it served the purpose of a war. And then we continue with the hot war in Ukraine, and of course we're seeing now people beginning to protest. We've seen revolts in cities around the world. We've seen them in France recently, and I think this these sort of stresses will continue to increase throughout the decade.
I want to agree with you that you just say that it is not temporary. I mean, one of the things that people who are, I'm 52, people who are a little bit older can definitely easily remember the 2008 crisis. Yeah. And if you just think back about how that played out, let's say through American politics, it took a long time for the capitalist class to even be hubristic enough to say that we had gotten out of it. And in 2016, when Trump was elected, most of the left analysis was still thinking in terms of that being set up by the economic crisis of 2008. That was still a consequence of the unrest and the dissatisfaction that was coming out of a busted long-term economic crisis, or busted economy. And then there were a couple of years, like 2-3 years, where things seemed to kind of almost get back on their feet, sort of boom. And then COVID hit. So we really have been struggling along for quite a long time. Before you know it, will have been 20 years since 2008. Yeah. But so I just wanted to.
And sorry, just to go back to your point about politicians, all they do is tell us, don't worry, it's temporary. And I've seen a pattern of this is temporary and it will pass. I think Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, saying, "Oh, don't worry, it's temporary. We need a bit of money now. We need to make a bit extra money here, credit, blah blah blah. So we need to interrupt. We need to break with the gold standard, but temporary." QE were supposed to be temporary in 2008, 2009. Remember, they told us, no, don't worry, it's just, an exceptional measure that we're taking now. And then it became ontological. It became, existential. If you don't do QE, you're dead. You can't sustain the economy without QEs. And then we've seen more and more quantitative easing, more and more money pumped into the system after 2008. And that has never stopped, but that is massively inflationary, and fundamentally it destroys our real economies. That's why I'm talking about controlled demolition, because what we're seeing now with this inflation that is kind of being, it's a management of crisis that we're talking about here, the management of crisis via inflation. And inflation makes us poorer. It's like an invisible tax. Effectively, that more our purchasing power is diminishing. But of course, for us, it means something. For 0.01%, or it means nothing, because for them, it really is nothing. But yeah. So my ultimate point is that in respect of financialization of the economy, is that to sustain this sort of financialization, you have to demolish the real economy little by little. Because if you continue to pump these amounts of money into the financial sector, you are effectively destroying the real economy.
Well, I want to ask you what you mean by demolish the real economy, because my understanding of, let's say the Great Depression was that the World War II devalued enough capital that after that capital destruction, the remaining powers in capital could come in, buy up the assets that were still around relatively cheaply. And because of that initial investment being much lower than what would have been the case before, there was a capacity to produce profit, even with labor productivity still being higher than it would have been 50 years earlier, in the 19th century. Despite the great technological advances and the massive amount of automated production and the devaluation of commodities that comes along with that, even so, after that massive amount of capital destruction, there could be a boom for 20, 30 years, right? And so is that what we're talking about? Not like the complete elimination of the capitalist system, the demolition of capitalism, but the demolition of assets, capitalist assets.
Well, the way I see it, if you're talking about the Great Depression and the glorious 30 years of economic boom, at least in the center, that's what you're referring to. To me, that was the last cycle of accumulation of real value creation that we saw in the history of capitalism. If you wanted to completely frank with you about it, that was because there you could still mobilize enough labor to produce real value in the real economy, right? So the cycle of accumulation was still value productive. It was a labor-intensive economy, assembly line economy. That is gone. That with automation is wiped out, literally wiped out. There's no way, that's why I'm saying there's no way of reigniting a labor-intensive economy any longer. If there is no way of doing it, then capital will have to rely more and more on these compensatory mechanisms like credit creation programs, like quantitative easing, all these very creative names that actually mean pumping more money into the system because the system cannot create enough money through taxation or whatever, to support itself. And I think we've passed the point of no return. We need to look at capital, with a historical mind, not ahistorically, because those crises were different. The crises we're seeing now are different from 19th, 20th century, even early 20th century crisis. Here we're talking about a bubble-to-bubble economy. It's really a bubble-to-bubble economy. You cannot go back to a real accumulation in such a way as to drive a new cycle of real capital accumulation. You cannot do it given the current technological infrastructure, given the coming fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, that will displace more and more labor. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about value productive labor, right? Because you can always give bullshit jobs to people, but that doesn't produce value, right? For the system itself. So that, the problem is both for labor and for capital together here. And for this reason, I think capital will have to rely more. First of all, it's becoming more and more authoritarian, with a tendency to becoming totalitarian, right? This is something that we can see very clearly. I think COVID has really demonstrated.
The lockdowns itself were clearly authoritarian, and everyone told themselves at the time, well, this is a temporary situation.
State of emergency.
For a little while, state of emergency. Right. We want to protect the public health. Obviously, we're not going to be locked in our homes forever. But, it's as if there's a hurricane happening outside our doors. So we all have to go into the basement, or like a bombing, campaign was coming. So, everyone stay indoors. That was sort of the feeling at first. But then it went on, and it came along with a bunch of other things. But I want to put this in context. The idea here with COVID being part of a controlled demolition, it really sounds to me like you're saying that we're moving from what I think of as capitalism itself, which always has to be based on the exploitation of labor, in which, as a Marxist, I always want to overcome and transcend that system. What you're saying is that capitalism itself, the powers that be, and the financial sector, the political sector, are attempting to do what the socialists could not, which is to break free of the need for the labor theory of value and create a system of government that will manage society based on automated production, but do it in an authoritarian political way. Is that?
I think that's the only way. The only way to do it, to manage it, given this condition, is to move from a liberal, consumerist capitalism, which corresponds to the Fordist period of growth up until the 70s, precisely when the Fordist mode of production imploded and was replaced by neoliberalism. Remember the inflation in the 1970s, etc., etc. The shift from a liberal consumerist type of capitalism based on mass labor exploitation to a authoritarian, hyper-financialized, debt-based type of capitalism, where labor will still matter insofar as labor will continue, unfortunately, to be exploited, perhaps even more than in the past, because commodities, one way or another, have to be produced, and machines need a bit of labor, to produce them, and also because there has to be the illusion that this is still a labor society, that the economy is still driven by labor, but that the basis of our economy is still labor. As a matter of fact, the basis of the economy has shifted to what once was just the appendix of the economy, and that is the financial sector. Now, that's the driver. And within the financial sector, the bond market is the epicenter. It's really the driver of our economy. The bond market is where debt is bought and sold, fundamentally, right? And that's really the core of the financial system and therefore also of the economy as such. I think that shift, we haven't digested yet. That shift has taken place.
And my understanding is that the reason why these economic crises emerge is because the value being a measure of the socially necessary time it takes to create commodities, and money being just an appearance of that kind of value, right?
Store of value,
runs up against a contradiction within itself, because it takes less and less time to create commodities, and therefore those commodities themselves have less and less value in terms of that labor time. But if you say, okay, it's an automated society, and the money has no value because it's not connected to the socially necessary labor time.
Yeah.
What is to stop us from, or any political force from saying, okay, well, since we don't need to worry about, since the money is sort of made up, why don't we just plan it out democratically how we're going to produce things? Why don't we just institute socialism of some kind? And I mean, like, what's the barrier there? That's what I'm asking.
Well, the barrier is capital itself that continues to run the show behind the scenes. It's money chasing money. It's a profit making system that we're dealing with here. So we need to break with the categories of capital in order to move to a post-capitalist society where effectively we could have much more time for ourselves and spend less time working, because there's no need for it anymore, because machines can do most of the work, right? So we need less time spent at work, and we can free up more time for other things. But the whole logic has to change, has to shift, because we're still unfortunately tied to value creation. Even though there's a compensatory mechanism in place, the system is still capitalist, and it's still based on the original formula of capitalism, which is money invested into labor to produce more money. The original, and so labor is still in a way the key ingredient for the system. However, the system is compensating for the mechanism that you just described, that there is less and less value being created through socially necessary labor. So I think that's where we are, and the first thing we need is to become aware of this, to gain consciousness of the critical awareness of this situation, and then hopefully we will move towards what you just described, a system where money doesn't have the same function that it has today. Money is not there just to become more money, which is what it does in capital, but it serves a different purpose. Labor is not just self-externalization of capital. It's not just a moment of capital itself. It's not the ingredient. It's not the fundamental ingredient for capitalist growth, but it becomes something else. But that requires a radical restructuring of the categories of capitalism as we know them today. And I think that's the difficult step, because we're still thinking, the limit of our imagination is in a way the limit of capital itself. Our imagination is defined in capitalist terms, and we need to go beyond that. We need to find a way of moving beyond, even the simple things, even the language of capital. We need to, create a new language that reflects new needs that are not the needs of capital anymore. So that I think is the big step ahead. But it requires social movements that are aware of a contradiction that can no longer be sustained, unless we want to. We want to endorse this descent into barbarism, because obviously that's what's lying ahead for us.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.